Okay, let's kick this off. Welcome to AI Change Desk, episode 15, Retained Artifact Check.
This
A team
is
uploads a
AI
customer
Change
spreadsheet on
Desk.
Thursday. On
See you
Friday,
next
someone
time.
pulls it back into a new ChatGPT workflow from library. By Monday, the custom GPT they rely on has crossed a model cutoff. Finance is asking why tool session costs drifted, and security wants to know who owns outside-in reports if something breaks. That is not four separate headlines. That is one operating board. AI work does not end when the chat tab closes anymore. It gets saved, it gets reused, it gets inherited by the next person, or the next workflow, or the next model version. And once that happens, the real question is not just whether the model was helpful. The real question is whether the organization knows what just became durable. And yes, I know retained artifact sounds like the kind of phrase a committee invents at 4:45 on a Friday. I know. Unfortunately, the thing underneath the phrase is very real. This is not a product tour episode. It is not a vague governance lecture. It is a durability episode, a residue episode, a who owns the aftermath episode. Because if AI outputs and uploaded files now stick around until somebody deletes them, then a lot of teams are already operating with a mental model that is out of date. They are still thinking in prompts and chats. The platform is increasingly behaving more like a retained workspace, and retained work always creates new expectations, retention rules, reuse rules, verification rules, deletion rules, intake rules when something goes wrong. So today we are staying with one through line. What changes once AI artifacts outlive the moment that created them? This is AI Change Desk. Thank you for choosing to tune in. Welcome back to AI Change Desk. I'm Michael. If you have been with me the last few weeks, there is a continuity line here, but I want to keep it light. Episode 11 was about the control surface. Episode 12 was about whether you could actually see adoption in the workflow. Episode 13 pushed us toward education, employment, and infrastructure readiness. Episode 14 moved the measurement problem upstream into commerce discovery. This week, the surface is smaller and, honestly, easier to miss. Not the storefront, not the dashboard, not even the model picker first. The artifact. The file someone uploaded, the deck someone reused, the spreadsheet someone assumed was still okay to pull forward. The custom GPT someone assumes still behaves the same way it did before a cutoff, the cost line someone assumes can wait until month end, the external report somebody hopes will land in somebody else's inbox. That is why this one matters, because retained AI work is where a lot of organizations drift from "this is a useful tool" into "we are now accumulating operational residue without really admitting it." And that residue is not automatically bad. Some of it is exactly what people want. Continuity is useful, recovered context is useful, reuse is useful, fewer duplicate uploads are useful, a saved document that can be pulled back into the next task is useful. But useful residue is still residue, and once something persists, somebody has to own the conditions under which it persists. So let us do this in the order it shows up in real life. What changed? Where teams get this wrong? The hidden trade-off. What I would decide by Friday. First, what actually changed? The important shift is not one giant launch. It is the stack of smaller operating changes that now overlap. OpenAI's current file library guidance says files you upload to and create in ChatGPT are saved to library so you can find and reuse them later. That includes documents, spreadsheets, presentations, and images. And the guidance says those files stay saved until users delete them manually. Temporary chat is different. ChatGPT Health is different where available, but the default pattern is persistence. That matters because it turns file handling into something longer lived than one chat session. The artifact can now carry forward. Second, the GPT 4.0 custom GPT boundary is now behind us. The current business models and limits guidance says GPT 4.0 was already retired from ChatGPT generally in February, and that business, enterprise, and EDU customers retained access to GPT 4.0 within custom GPTs until April 3rd, 2026. After April 3rd, the guidance says GPT 4.0 is fully retired across all plans, so the planning window is over. If a team was waiting for a future migration date to get serious, that date has already passed. Now, the useful question is, what changed in practice? Prompt behavior, tool behavior, output shape, human review burden? That is verification work now. Third, Google introduced Gemma 4 on April 2nd, 2026, and described it as its most intelligent open models to date, built for advanced reasoning and agentic workflows. Google also says developers have downloaded Gemma more than 400 million times and built more than 100,000 variants across the ecosystem. That second number is ecosystem enthusiasm, not your migration plan. Still, it is a signal. Open model optionality is not just an ideological conversation right now. It is getting more practical. Fourth, OpenAI pricing still shows that starting March 31st, 2026, containers are billed per 20-minute session per container. I want to keep that scoped correctly. This is not all OpenAI got more expensive. This is about built-in tool execution inside containerized environments. Still, if you have workflows that touch that surface, same week spend variance can be real before your monthly dashboard catches up. And finally, the safety bug bounty that OpenAI launched on March 25th is still live. The announcement says the public program is focused on identifying AI abuse and safety risks across products, and that submissions are triaged by OpenAI's safety and security bug bounty teams and may be rerouted depending on scope and ownership. That is OpenAI's own statement. I am not turning it into a whole market census, but as an operator signal, it matters. Outside-in safety reporting is part of the operating environment, whether your internal ownership model is ready or not. Put those together and the shift gets clearer. Files persist, model assumptions expire, open model alternatives improve, tool session costs turn live, and outside-in safety intake becomes a real routing problem. That is not 5 random updates. That is one durable work problem. And I know that phrase, durable work problem, is not exactly doing stand-up comedy for us, but it is the right frame because what changed is not only the model, what changed is the shelf life of the work around the model. Let me make this more concrete, because I do not think the problem shows up first as policy language. I think it shows up as one file that keeps moving farther than anybody expected. Imagine a revenue operations manager upload the pricing spreadsheet into ChatGPT to clean up category names and generate a summary for an internal meeting. That feels contained. It feels local. It feels like one moment of assistance. Then the file stays in library. Next week, somebody else on the team pulls it back into a new workflow to draft customer-facing talking points. Now the artifact is no longer just an input. It is a piece of inherited context. And the second user is inheriting more than the file. They are inheriting the assumptions around why it was safe to use the first time. Was the original sheet supposed to be in there? Was it redacted enough? Was it internal only? Did the first workflow produce something a second workflow can safely build on? Is anybody expected to delete it on a cadence? If the answer to all of that is people will probably know, then the team does not have a retention model. It has hope. And look, hope is lovely in many parts of life. This is not one of them. That is why I think a lot of organizations are still naming the wrong unit of control. They keep talking about chat access or model access or approved platforms. Those matter. But once files persist until deletion, the unit that deserves management attention is the retained artifact. A retained artifact can travel. It can be reopened. It can be reshaped. It can pick up new risk without changing its file name. And the people who touch it second or third may never see the original judgment call that created it. That is not a catastrophic story. It is a normal story. And normal stories are where operations actually live. So if you are asking yourself whether this is a real issue, do not start with, what is our AI policy? Start with something sharper. What is one artifact in our environment that is more reusable now than it was a month ago? A spreadsheet, a presentation, a proposal draft, an image, a structured notes file. Then ask one more question. If that artifact gets reused tomorrow by the wrong person in the wrong workflow or under a changed model, what protects us? If the answer is vague, that is the work. Now, the bigger point underneath that, retained artifacts are a control surface now. The biggest mistake teams will make here is treating save files as a convenience feature. And look, they are a convenience feature. They are also more than that. If uploaded and created files are saved until manual deletion, then those files start behaving less like transient prompt inputs and more like retained work objects. Not legal records automatically, not system of record documents automatically, but also not disposable session noise anymore. And that difference matters. Because organizations are pretty good at understanding records when the system already looks like a record system. SharePoint feels retained, Drive feels retained, a CRM record feels retained. People know, at least roughly, that those systems have persistence consequences. A conversational interface hides that. It still feels lightweight, it still feels session-based, it still feels reversible, even when the underlying artifact is not actually disappearing. That is where operating drift begins. A user uploads something in a hurry, a manager reuses it later, a second user inherits the output shape. Nobody quite remembers whether the original file belonged there in the first place. Nobody is sure whether it should still be there now. And because the system is easy, the reuse feels normal before the rule is normal. That is why the useful unit here is not just file saved or file deleted. The useful unit is the retained artifact, a document, spreadsheet, image, or presentation that can travel across work sessions and continue to influence new work. Once you frame it that way, the control questions get better. Not, are people using library? Too generic. Not, did we turn it on? Too shallow. The real questions are, what kinds of artifacts are allowed to persist? What kinds are not? What review is required before reuse in customer-facing work? What deletion guidance exists? And who is accountable when a saved artifact crosses a boundary it should not cross? This is also where EP012 comes back without repeating itself. Activity is not the point. A rising count of saved files is not the point. The point is whether the organization can tell the difference between useful continuity and unmanaged residue. So, if I were talking to a team this week, I would tell them to stop debating abstract AI policy and start with something narrower and more honest. A retained artifact rule. One page, nothing ornate. What can never be stored? What can be stored temporarily? What requires pre-share review before reuse? What gets deleted on a fixed cadence? What gets escalated if somebody is unsure? That one page is probably worth more this week than another broad principles memo. Because people do not need a philosophy of persistence. They need to know what they are allowed to keep. And yes, I realize write a retained artifact rule does not sound like anyone's idea of a thrilling Thursday, mine included. Still, this is the kind of small, boring document that prevents much more annoying, boring problems later. Now, here's where teams get this wrong, and this is where they lose time they did not need to lose. Because the failure mode here is not dramatic, it is procedural, it is boring. And boring failures are exactly the ones that slip through. Teams get this wrong in 5 predictable ways. First, they approve the platform and assume the workflow is governed. ChatGPT is approved tells you almost nothing about whether file reuse is being handled well. Approval at the platform layer is not workflow clarity. Second, they rely on user intuition for deletion. That is basically the same as having no deletion rule. If the guidance is people will use judgment, what you usually get is inconsistency, memory drift, and a growing set of files that nobody feels directly responsible for. Third, they treat model retirement as a communications event instead of a verification event. A notice goes out, somebody says migration is handled, then nobody actually runs side-by-side checks on the workflows that mattered. That is not readiness. That is administrative optimism. Fourth, they separate cost review from workflow review. Finance sees the line item. Product sees the feature usage. Operations sees the process change. No one is wrong, but if no one is responsible for reconciling those views inside the same week, spendrift becomes a narrative fight instead of an operating adjustment. And fifth, they assume an outside-in safety channel is somebody else's job until the report arrives. That is a terrible moment to discover ownership. If a meaningful external report lands and the first question is, who handles this? Then you are already behind. Here's the pattern under all 5 mistakes. Organizations keep wanting AI to stay conceptually small after the workflow has already made it structurally larger. They want the artifact to feel like a prompt. They want the cutoff to feel like a note. They want the spend shift to feel like accounting. They want the safety report to feel hypothetical. But the system has already moved on. The surface is larger now. The question is whether your operating model has caught up. And this is the part where I start sounding like the least fun person in the meeting, which, to be fair, is occasionally my professional role. But the point stands. If the system got structurally bigger, the operating model cannot stay emotionally attached to the smaller version. Now, the hidden trade-off, and I think this is the part people underexplain. The hidden trade-off is not just risk, it is comfort. Persistence creates comfort, and comfort is exactly why people will like it. A saved file is easier than a repeated upload. A reusable artifact is easier than recreating context. A stable-seeming workflow feels more mature than a blank canvas. That comfort is real. It is not fake. And if we pretend the benefit is imaginary, we miss the reason teams will lean into it. But comfort has a side effect. It lowers the perceived friction of reuse faster than it raises the discipline around reuse. That is the trade-off. When the artifact is right there, the next step feels easy. Just pull it back in. Just use last week's version. Just run it through the same GPT. Just repurpose the draft. And sometimes that is fine. Sometimes it is efficient. Sometimes it is exactly the right move. But what gets lost is the question of whether the context that made the artifact safe is still true. Is the data still appropriate for this use? Is the model behavior still the same after the cutoff? Is the draft still correct under the new workflow? Is this artifact still something we would want retained at all? That is why I keep coming back to residue. The problem is not that the system remembers. The problem is that memory creates inherited assumptions, and inherited assumptions are where teams make polite, expensive mistakes. So I would frame the hidden trade-off like this. Continuity improves speed. It can also quietly widen the half-life of bad assumptions. That is a much better operating question than asking whether persistence is simply good or bad, because persistence is clearly useful. The real question is whether your organization has a way to interrupt reuse when the assumptions underneath it have changed. And honestly, this is why the feature feels so helpful, right up until it does not. The convenience arrives first. The operational maturity usually arrives later, sometimes much later, sometimes after an extremely tedious meeting that could have been avoided. Now let us talk about the cutoff, because this one is straightforward and still easy to mishandle. The OpenAI business models and limits guidance is very plain here. GPT 4.0 remained available within custom GPTs for business, enterprise, and EDU until April 3rd, 2026. After that, it is fully retired across plans. So, the planning posture has expired. This is no longer a we should get ready story. It is a show me what changed story. And this is where teams will be tempted to underreact because if a workflow still appears to function, people will call that success. But functioning and matching expected behavior are not the same thing. A workflow can still produce output while quietly shifting in all the places that matter. Instruction following nuance, tool call pattern, reliability at the edges, how much cleanup humans now have to do, whether fallback paths trigger more often, whether the output shape still matches downstream automations. That is why the right move this week is not an email reminder. It is a short verification sprint. Pick the custom GPT workflows that matter, run the same prompts, check the same artifacts, see what drifted. And if you are tempted to say, well, we have not seen complaints yet, I would push back gently on that. The absence of complaint is not proof of stability. It often just means the cleanup burden has not been turned into a formal signal. Mildly annoying information, still information. So do something smaller and sharper. 5 prompts, 3 expected outputs, 2 real reviewers, 1 owner. Do it this week. Let me make that concrete too. Imagine a support operations team that built a custom GPT to normalize incoming tickets, suggest routing, and draft a first internal summary before a human responds. On paper, the workflow still works after the cutoff. Nothing crashes, the summaries still appear, the triage board still fills up. But once the team actually compares outputs, they notice small changes. The draft summaries are slightly shorter, the tool calls miss one internal knowledge source more often. Escalation language is a little less conservative, and the downstream analyst now spends an extra 90 seconds fixing edge cases on every 10th ticket. None of that looks like a dramatic failure. That is exactly why it gets missed. If the team only watches whether the workflow still returns output, it will say the system is healthy. If the team actually verifies behavior, it will discover a different truth. The workflow still functions, but the human cleanup burden changed. That is the real reason to run verification now. Not because retirement notices are exciting, because quiet drift is expensive. Because once the cutoff is behind you, the organization either verifies reality or inherits it blindly. And that is not a great trade. Now, Gemma 4. I want to be careful here because open model stories can get weird very fast. Either they get treated like ideology or they get treated like instant migration pressure. Neither one is useful. What Google is saying with Gemma 4 is that these are its most intelligent open models to date, built for advanced reasoning and agentic workflows. That does not mean hosted systems are obsolete. It does mean the option set got more interesting, and that matters for one reason above all. Serious optionality changes the quality of internal conversations. If the open alternative is too weak, nobody has to think very hard. The default hosted path wins by default. But when the open alternative becomes more credible, the organization has to get more honest about what it actually values. Latency, control, cost predictability, data locality, security boundaries, team skill requirements, maintenance burden, evaluation overhead. Now, this is where leaders will misread the moment. Some will think Gemma 4 means they should move fast to an open stack. That is usually too fast. Others will think it is just ecosystem noise and ignore it. That is often too dismissive. The better read is narrower. Gemma 4 makes it more reasonable to run one real evaluation lane, one contained workflow, one success rubric, one honest comparison. Not a migration announcement, not a strategy offsite fantasy, a lane. Maybe one internal document workflow, maybe one low-risk summarization task, maybe one retrieval-heavy internal process where data locality and cost discipline both matter. What you want out of that lane is not a winner first. You want clarity first. Where is hosted still clearly stronger? Where is local or open suddenly plausible? Where does the human review burden get heavier, not lighter? Take an internal policy summarization workflow. The team already has a hosted path that works well enough, but the documents are sensitive, the output shape is structured, and the cost profile is annoying. That is a pretty good lane for a contained comparison. Run the same document set through the current hosted workflow and a narrow Gemma 4 evaluation path. Look at the outputs side by side. Not just quality in the abstract, look at cleanup time, look at citation fidelity, look at infrastructure overhead, look at who has to maintain what. If the open path wins on locality but loses badly on maintenance burden, that is useful. If the hosted path remains stronger on reliability but now looks materially more expensive, that is useful. If both are viable but one requires far more human review than expected, that is useful. That is what a real evaluation lane gives you. Not ideology, not noise, clarity. And this is why I do not want teams turning open model stories into theater. The point is not to have an opinion. The point is to run one honest lane and come back with something better than vibes. 2 more live clocks, and then I will give you the Friday decisions. The first is cost drift. The pricing page still says containers are billed per 20-minute session per container starting March 31st, 2026. Again, stay disciplined on scope. This is not all usage. This is not ordinary text generation. This is the built-in tool execution surface. But for teams using that surface, the first week lesson is simple. Stable usage volume does not guarantee stable spend behavior. Not after a pricing boundary, not after workflow changes, not after people start leaning harder on saved artifacts or tool execution paths. If your organization waits for month-end totals, it will learn the wrong lesson too late. What you need this week is daily, lane-by-lane reconciliation for the workflows that matter. Nothing grand, just honest measurement. Plan versus actual. 5 days, same time every day, one owner. Again, not glamorous, still necessary. And frankly, this is where a lot of expensive confusion comes from. People think stable usage means stable cost. Then the invoice arrives, everybody becomes much more philosophical than usual, and suddenly we are pretending this was unpredictable. Usually, it was not. Usually, nobody just looks soon enough. The second live clock is safety intake. OpenAI's safety bug bounty announcement says submissions are triaged by the safety and security bug bounty teams and may be rerouted depending on scope and ownership. That is their system. The useful question is whether your system has an equivalent level of clarity when an external signal touches your workflow. Because if your team uses AI in real production work, eventually some outside-in signal is going to land. A researcher note, a customer escalation, a vendor advisory, a weird failure report. Maybe not dramatic, maybe not catastrophic, but enough to require a response. And if there is no named intake owner, no severity rule, and no response clock, then you are improvising under pressure for no reason. That is why I think cost drift and safety intake belong together. They are both late if ignored problems. Not glamorous, not keynote material, but exactly the kind of thing that makes an AI rollout feel disciplined or sloppy. And look, I know this is the stretch in the episode where I sound like I am handing out chores. That is because I am. But they are the right chores. So if I were running this board this week, here's what I would decide by Friday. First, publish a retained artifact rule. One page, not a novel, not a giant policy stack, just clarity. What can be saved, what cannot, what needs deletion, what needs pre-share review, where uncertainty gets escalated. Second, assign one owner to post cutoff custom GPT verification. Not a loose working group, one owner. That person can coordinate reviewers, but the accountability has to be nameable. Third, reconcile tool session spend daily for 5 days, not monthly, this week. Break it into workflow lanes. See where assumptions broke. Decide where you need thresholds. Fourth, pick one open model pilot lane. One, not a platform migration, a lane with explicit success criteria, human review expectations, and a stop condition. Fifth, name one external safety intake owner and publish an SLA. If a signal arrives, where does it go? Who decides severity? And how fast does somebody have to respond? And there is one more thing I would say out loud to the team. Something like this. We are not treating persistence as a convenience setting anymore. We are treating it as a workflow condition. If an AI artifact can persist, then its reuse, deletion, verification, and escalation paths need to be explicit. That sentence alone would clean up a lot of ambiguity, because what people usually need is not a masterclass. They need permission to treat the new behavior like real operations. And if I were making this even more practical, I would give every team one quarter-level decision to make. If you run AI in client-facing or customer support workflows, decide this quarter what your retention tier is, not just whether a library is useful, whether those artifacts belong in a short life tier, a review before reuse tier, or a never store here tier. If you run AI in internal productivity workflows, decide this quarter which model-dependent workflows require regression checks every time a major model transition lands. Do not treat that like optional hygiene. Treat it like change management. If you run a finance or operations board, decide this quarter which AI-assisted workflows get same-week spend review instead of month-end review. The day the pricing boundary changes is not the day to discover that nobody owns variance interpretation. And if you own trust, risk, or security, decide this quarter where outside-in AI reports go. Who reads them first, what severity rubric they use, and when escalation starts. Do not wait for the first uncomfortable email. That is the wrong moment to draft the process. None of those are giant transformation projects. They are the kind of decisions a competent organization can actually make, which is exactly why they matter. So here's the question I would leave in front of any team using AI in production work this week. What is your organization currently keeping, reusing, or routing forward through AI systems without a named owner? Because once the artifact outlives the chat, the operating model has to outlive the chat too. And if it does not, the system will keep more than your team is actually prepared to manage. This is AI Change Desk. See you next time.